The invitation came on a rainy Tuesday evening, just as Jack was settling into his favorite armchair with a glass of red wine. His phone buzzed insistently, a message lighting up the screen. It was from Ethan, his oldest friend. "Big trip, next weekend. Remote camping spot, great trails and epic views, don't miss it. Bring Amelia." Jack smiled faintly. Ethan was always brimming with enthusiasm, the kind of energy that drew people in. A camping trip might be just what they needed. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Amelia was scrolling through her laptop. She looked tired, her usual spark dimmed by long hours at the office. Jack set his wine down and walked over, leaning against the counter. "Ethan's organizing a camping trip," he said. "Next weekend. What do you think?" Amelia barely glanced up. "Camping? It's been a while." "Too long," he said softly, his hand brushing hers. "It could be good for us. Get away, breathe some fresh air." She hesitated, her lips curving into a small smile. "All right, let's do it." The group met early Saturday morning at a remote trailhead. Jack and Amelia arrived in their SUV, their gear carefully packed. Ethan was already there, directing the others with his usual charisma. "Jack! Amelia!" Ethan called, jogging over. His broad smile and easy confidence made him impossible to dislike. "Glad you could make it." Amelia smiled, her eyes lingering on Ethan a moment longer than Jack liked. Wouldn't miss it. They set off, the first stretch of the trail weaving through a dense forest. Jack and Amelia walked together, their hands brushing occasionally. It felt nice, Jack thought, to be out in nature with her. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. When they reached the campsite that evening, the group was in high spirits. Tents were pitched, a fire crackled, and Ethan handed around flasks of whiskey. As the night wore on, Jack sat beside Amelia, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. She leaned into him, her face softened by the glow of the firelight. "It's beautiful here," she said, her voice quiet. "It is," Jack murmured, his lips brushing her temple. For a moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Jack's hand slid down her arm, his fingers intertwining with hers. She looked up at him, her eyes glinting in the firelight, and he felt a pang of longing, something they hadn't shared in far too long. Later that night, after the others had retreated to their tents, Jack and Amelia lingered by the fire. The stars above were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds. Jack reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Amelia's ear. "I've missed this," he said softly. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Missed what?" "Us, being close, feeling like we're on the same page." Amelia's gaze dropped, her hand tracing idle patterns on her leg. "I've missed it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack leaned closer, his hand sliding up to cup her cheek. For a moment he hesitated, searching her face for a sign. When she didn't pull away, he closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a tender kiss. It wasn't like the kisses they had shared in their early years, full of youthful passion and fire. This was slower, deeper, laden with unspoken emotions. As the kiss deepened, Jack pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as if to shield her from the world. The warmth of the fire faded, replaced by the heat of their embrace. For a fleeting moment, Jack felt whole again, as though the fractures in their marriage could be mended by this shared intimacy. But even as they lost themselves in the moment, a shadow of doubt lingered at the edge of Jack's mind. The next morning, the group set off on a more challenging trail. The path was steep, winding through rocky terrain, with breathtaking views of the valley below. Amelia and Ethan walked ahead, their laughter ringing out as they navigated the trail together. Jack hung back, his eyes fixed on the way Amelia leaned toward Ethan, her hand brushing his arm as she steadied herself on a narrow ledge. "Having fun back there?" Ethan called, glancing over his shoulder. Jack forced a smile. Just enjoying the view." The rest of the day passed in a blur of exertion and stunning vistas, but Jack couldn't shake the unease building inside him. That evening, as the group relaxed around the fire, Jack noticed Amelia slipping away. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps she needed some time alone. But when Ethan followed her moments later, his instincts kicked in. He waited a few minutes before rising, pretending to stretch. No one paid him much attention as he slipped into the darkness, the faint sound of voices guiding him toward the riverbank. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Amelia and Ethan were standing close, their faces inches apart. Her hand rested on his chest, his fingers lightly grazing her arm. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "What the hell is this?" Amelia jumped back, her face pale. "Jack, Save it," he snapped, his voice trembling with anger. He turned to Ethan. "You're supposed to be my friend." Ethan raised his hands defensively. "Jack, it's not what it looks like." "Really? Then tell me what it is, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with my wife." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "Jack, please, let me explain." The tension crackled like the campfire behind them, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. Jack's fists were clenched, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Explain what?" he demanded, glaring at Amelia. "Explain why you've been sneaking off with him?" He jabbed a finger toward Ethan, who stood rooted to the spot, his usual confidence shattered. Amelia stepped closer, her hands raised as though to placate him. "It's not what you think, Jack." "Then what is it?" he shot back, his voice rising. "You've been distant for months, and now I catch you here, alone, with him, looking like—" "Like what?" Amelia's voice cracked, her tears now flowing freely. "Like someone who's been lost? Like someone who doesn't know how to talk to her own husband anymore?" Her words caught Jack off guard, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion. "You could have talked to me. You should have talked to me." "I tried," she cried, "but every time, it's like we're speaking different languages. I needed someone to listen, someone who—" She stopped herself, glancing guiltily at Ethan. Jack's chest tightened as the realization hit him. Someone who wasn't me. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. "Jack, I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear." Jack turned on him, his fury reigniting. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You think that makes it better? You're supposed to be my friend, Ethan. How long has this been going on?" "It hasn't," Amelia said quickly, stepping between them. "I swear, it hasn't. Tonight was the first." Jack held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it. Either of you." He stormed back toward the camp, leaving them standing in stunned silence by the river. Jack sat alone by the dying campfire, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, heartbreak, and betrayal. The rest of the group was asleep, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. He thought back to the early days of his relationship with Amelia, the spontaneous road trips, the way she used to light up whenever she saw him, the nights they stayed up talking until dawn. Where had it all gone wrong? Jack heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Amelia standing hesitantly at the edge of the firelight. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes pleading. "Can I sit?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, but he didn't tell her to leave either. She took it as permission and lowered herself onto the log beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the embers and the distant rustle of the trees. "I never wanted to hurt you," Amelia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to believe that." Jack laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to hurt me. But you did. You destroyed everything." Tears welled in her eyes again. I've felt so lost, Jack. Like we've been living separate lives under the same roof. And Ethan? He listened to me when I didn't know how to reach you. That's what marriage is supposed to be for, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't turn to someone else when things get hard. You turn to me, or at least, you're supposed to. Amelia reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. I don't know if I can forgive this, he said, his voice trembling. I don't even know who you are anymore. The next morning, the camp was heavy with unspoken tension. Jack avoided both Amelia and Ethan, busying himself with packing up their gear. The rest of the group noticed his silence, but no one dared to ask what had happened. Amelia tried several times to approach him, but he shut her down with curt one-word responses. She eventually gave up, retreating to her tent to pack in solitude. Ethan, meanwhile, kept his distance, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by an awkward, subdued silence. By the time the group set off on the trail, the camaraderie that had marked the trip's start was gone. As they hiked, Jack's mind wandered back to the early days of their marriage. He remembered a camping trip they had taken in their first year together, just the two of them. They had gotten lost on the trail and ended up pitching their tent in a clearing by a small waterfall. It was cold that night, and they had huddled together in their sleeping bag, their laughter echoing in the stillness of the woods. He remembered the way she had kissed him, slow and lingering, as though they had all the time in the world. They made love that night under the stars, their connection electric and unshakable. But that felt like a lifetime ago. The trail grew steeper as the group neared the final leg of their journey. Jack's legs burned with exertion, but he welcomed the physical distraction from the turmoil in his heart. At one point, the group paused to catch their breath at a rocky outcrop with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Ethan approached Jack cautiously. Hey, he said, his tone tentative. Can we talk? Jack didn't look at him. What's there to talk about? Ethan sighed. I messed up, I know that. But you have to believe me. Nothing happened between me and Amelia. Not really. Jack turned to him, his eyes blazing. Not really? You think that makes it better? You think it changes anything? Ethan had no answer. Jack shook his head, his voice low and firm. Stay away from me. And stay away from her. The group continued their trek in heavy silence. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, their ominous presence a reflection of the tension in the air. Jack kept his distance from both Amelia and Ethan, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of anger and heartbreak. By the time they reached the campsite for the night, the first drops of rain were falling. The group scrambled to pitch their tents, the air electric with the threat of the approaching storm. Amelia approached Jack as he struggled with the rainfly on his tent. Let me help, she offered softly. He glanced at her, his expression hard. I don't need your help. Jack, please, she said, her voice trembling. We need to talk. Talk? He barked out a bitter laugh. Now you want to talk? After sneaking around with him? Her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't like that. I made a mistake, but it wasn't. Stop, he said, his voice rising. Just stop. I don't want your excuses, Amelia. I don't want anything from you anymore. The rain began to fall harder, the drops mingling with the tears on her face. I still love you, she whispered. Jack froze, her words cutting through his rage like a blade. For a moment, he saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. But the weight of her betrayal was too much to bear. If you loved me, he said quietly, you wouldn't have done this. The rain turned into a full-blown downpour, forcing the group to take shelter in their tents. Jack lay awake, listening to the rhythmic drumming on the fabric above him. Sleep felt impossible, his mind racing with thoughts of Amelia and the life they had built together. He thought of their wedding day, the way she had looked at him as she walked down the aisle, her eyes bright with love and promise. He thought of the nights they had spent talking about their future, dreaming of the adventures they would share. How had it all come to this? A flash of lightning illuminated the tent, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the ground. Jack closed his eyes, willing himself to block out the storm both inside and out. The storm passed by morning, leaving the campsite drenched but calm. The group packed up in uneasy silence, their usual camaraderie replaced by a heavy tension. Amelia avoided Jack's gaze as they prepared to set off, her movements mechanical and subdued. Ethan, too, kept his distance, his usual confidence replaced by an awkward quiet. As they began the final leg of their journey, Jack felt the weight of their unfinished conversation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her, or if he even wanted to. The trail led them to a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. The group paused to rest, and Jack found himself standing beside Amelia for the first time since their confrontation. "This place is beautiful," she said softly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "It is," he replied, his tone neutral. She hesitated before speaking again. "Do you remember our first camping trip? That night by the waterfall?" Jack nodded, his chest tightening at the memory. "I remember. It was a Sunday and windy." Amelia's voice wavered. "I miss those days, when it felt like we had the whole world ahead of us." Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We did, but you threw it away." Her eyes filled with tears and she looked down. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The trail ahead was narrow and treacherous, winding along the edge of a steep cliff. The group moved carefully, their focus on every step. Amelia walked ahead of Jack, her footing steady despite the loose gravel beneath her boots. But as she stepped onto a particularly unstable section, the ground gave way beneath her. "Amelia!" Jack shouted, his heart leaping into his throat. She grabbed onto a protruding root, her body dangling precariously over the edge. Jack dropped his pack and scrambled forward, reaching out to her. "Hold on," he yelled, his hand closing around hers. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything else fell away. He pulled her up with all his strength, his arms wrapping around her as they collapsed onto solid ground. Amelia clung to him, her body trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jack didn't respond, his own emotions too raw to put into words. That evening, as the group settled into their final campsite, Jack found himself sitting alone by the fire. Amelia approached hesitantly, her movements tentative. "Can I sit?" she asked. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need you to know how sorry I am, for everything." Jack remained silent, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite name. "I was selfish," she continued. "I let my insecurities and fears get the better of me, and I hurt the one person who always believed in me." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Jack turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Amelia, but I know that I still love you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she reached for his hand. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worth it, if you'll let me." Jack hesitated before squeezing her hand. "We'll see." The last morning of the trip was filled with the quiet rustle of tents being packed and gear being secured. The group moved with a subdued energy, their excitement from the first day replaced by fatigue, and in some cases, tension too heavy to name. Jack kept to himself, his thoughts a relentless tug-of-war. He hadn't spoken to Ethan since pulling Amelia from the edge of the cliff, and the man had wisely stayed out of his way. But Amelia was harder to avoid. She hovered nearby as he adjusted the straps of his pack, her face pale and drawn. "Jack," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "What is it?" I need you to know how much this weekend has made me realize what I could lose, what I already almost lost." Jack straightened, his jaw tightening. "Amelia, if that's true, then you've got a hell of a way of showing it." Her expression crumpled, but she nodded. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I hope you'll let me earn one." Jack said nothing, slinging his pack over his shoulders and walking toward the others. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling, each step feeling heavier than the last. Jack kept his focus on the path ahead, refusing to look back at Amelia or Ethan. By the time they reached the parking lot, the group was visibly relieved to be done. There were handshakes, hugs, and promises to keep in touch. But the moment was lost on Jack. As the group began to disperse, Ethan approached him, his face lined with regret. "Jack, wait." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" I need to say I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice strained. "I never should have crossed that line." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "You didn't just cross the line, Ethan. You blew it to hell. And for what? A moment of connection?" Ethan flinched but didn't respond. Jack shook his head. "You're not the one who's going to fix this. Stay out of my life, stay out of hers." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping as he walked away. The drive home was painfully silent. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jack kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the wheel firm enough to turn his knuckles white. "Jack?" she said hesitantly. He didn't respond. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I need you to believe me when I say that nothing physical happened. Not with Ethan. Not ever." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "That's supposed to make me feel better? That you only emotionally betrayed me?" Her voice broke. "I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I saw the look in your eyes that night. I've never hated myself more." He glanced at her, his face hard. "You should have realized it long before then." The rest of the drive was quiet, the weight of her words hanging between them. The tension boiled over when they got home. Jack dropped his pack in the hallway and turned to face Amelia. "Do you think an apology is enough to fix this?" he asked, his voice low but seething. "No," she said quickly. "I don't, but I want to try." "Jack, I love you. I love you more than anything, and I can't imagine my life without you." Jack shook his head, his hands trembling. "You had a funny way of showing it, Amelia. Do you know what it felt like, watching you with him? Knowing that I wasn't enough for you anymore?" "You are enough," she cried, stepping toward him. "You've always been enough. I was the one who wasn't. I let my doubts and my selfishness blind me, and I hate myself for it." Jack stared at her, his chest heaving. "I don't know if I can trust you again. And without trust, what do we have?" Her tears flowed freely now, her voice cracking. "We have everything we've built together. We have love. And I will spend every day proving that you can trust me again, Jack. Please, don't give up on us." In the weeks that followed, Amelia made good on her promise. She left her job, citing the toxic environment that had contributed to her distance. She deleted Ethan's number, blocked him on every platform, and cut off all contact. Jack watched her efforts with cautious optimism, but the wounds ran deep. He found himself second-guessing her words, doubting her actions even when there was no reason to. One night, as they sat in the living room, Amelia reached for his hand. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I hope you'll let me build something new with you." Jack looked at her, the love he still felt warring with the pain she had caused. "It's going to take time. A lot of time." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Months turned into a year, and slowly, the cracks in their relationship began to heal. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, arguments that reopened old wounds. But they also found moments of joy, rediscovering the connection that had brought them together in the first place. On the anniversary of the trip, Jack and Amelia returned to the trailhead. They hiked to the same clearing where Jack had pulled her to safety, the memory of that day heavy in the air. Standing at the edge of the cliff, Amelia turned to him. "Thank you for not letting me fall." Jack looked at her, his eyes soft. "I'm still figuring out how to catch us both." They stood there in silence, the wind rushing. Beginning, and for now, that was enough. Years later, Jack stood at the edge of a different trail, his young daughter tugging at his hand. Amelia stood beside him, her laughter ringing out as their son tried to chase a butterfly. They had rebuilt what had been broken, not as it was before, but as something new. Their love, tested and scarred, had endured. As they set off down the trail, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to walk it with her.